Welcome back to the Fleeting Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Leffler, the armchair attorney. I am so grateful for everyone who joins us live for these programs or who downloads the content on the Apple Podcast or Spotify or Buzzsprout or wherever you get your podcast. I cannot emphasize enough how grateful I am for the opportunity to bring really interesting conversations to you, fleeting though they may be. And we have a very interesting podcast today. We'll get to that in just a moment. A bit of housekeeping. Next week, I will be at the Journal of Commerce Inland Distribution Conference, September 30th through October 2nd, 2024, at the Westin in Chicago's River North neighborhood. We're talking all things supply chain, but I'll actually be leading a session on post-employment restrictive covenants. Non-competes to be specific, but we all will talk about the non-solicits, the non-disparagements, and of course, the non-disclosures. I have to also give a shout out to my friends over at DAT, Dial a Truck. Since 1978, DAT has been helping truckers and motor carriers of all sorts find loads to move across this great country. Freight doesn't stop. It never has. It never will. And DAT has been helping everybody in the supply chain find that equipment at the right time, at the right price to get things moving. I appreciate their support on my pallid bust of Apollo, somewhat adjacent to my chamber. Not exactly near it, though. Look, there is something unfolding right now on the East Coast of America's greatest ports, and I don't think enough people are talking about it. There are a lot of people talking about it, let me be clear, but what is at stake is something that is truly interesting. There is a contract between the Longshoremen and an entity that basically this is the people who are moving things off of these boats every single day. And their contract goes up at the end of September. Come Tuesday, October 1st, if there's no new contract, what happens? What has been discussed so far is the potential for 45,000 dock workers to strike across 35 or 36 American ports. What does that mean to the American supply chain? It's the next crisis that so few people truly understand, myself included. Now, my superpower, if I had a superpower, is to know where the limitations of my knowledge end. Where do I need help from experts? And that is exactly what I have for you today. We'll be welcoming Sal Mercogliano, who's a professor of maritime history, to help us unpack the history of this great challenge we're seeing in front of us and hopefully give us some better understanding of what is to come. There was a time when the phrase "workers of the world unite" could humble empires, and it did. It could stop giant organizations and countries all across the world in their tracks. But those days are no longer here. There was a time, let's say 1980, when 60 to 70% of all truckers themselves were unionized. It's a small fraction today following deregulation. At issue is not just wages, it is the existential crisis that is automation. If you look at the manufacturing capabilities of major consumer products companies, automation has been creeping in for decades and decades. No one is looking to go back to the days of hand packing soap or hand packing deodorant. That would be way too expensive for the American consumer. And so we look at ways to automate, not just the trucks, not just the trailers, but ultimately how we move everything. And I could not be more excited to bring on my guest, Professor Sal Mercogliano. Sal, how are you?
Matthew, I am fine. Thank you so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to this.
I am beyond excited to have you here. You have one of the best YouTube channels out there when it comes to breaking down what's going on with shipping across the globe, whether it's strife in combat zones or it's what we're looking at right now. But for the folks who don't know you and what you do, who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I am an associate professor of history at Campbell University. I'm the chair of the history department here. But before that, in another life, I was a merchant mariner. I went to the State University of New York Maritime College, got a BS in marine transportation. I sailed for the Merchant Marine. I worked ashore for them and then swallowed the anchor, came ashore and decided to go on the academic route. So did a master's in maritime history and nautical archaeology from East Carolina University. So underwater diving and looking at wrecks was a little bit of a career for me for a while. And then got a PhD at the University of Alabama in military and naval history. And, my focus has been on history. However, one of my key jobs I got on the side in 2008 is I started teaching for the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy a course on maritime industry policy. So it really started getting me in what's going on in the industry. So a lot of the people that were in the class were involved in the industry. So it was great. I learned a lot, as a good professor does, in a class along with the students. Started writing for GCaptain, an online maritime news site. And then really where everything kind of blew up for me and got me really immersed in this in a large way is when Ever Given took a right turn in the Suez Canal.
I remember that. I remember
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and when she wound up with her bow in Asia and a stern in Africa, and for 6 days global shipping got kind of locked in, I did a whole series of newscasts with a variety of institutions, from the BBC to every news outlet I can think of. And one of the things that was great is I love doing the news outlets, but they were short, brief little things. And I'm a history professor. I like talk. And so I decided to do some longer videos. I started posting them to YouTube. And what started was what's going on in the Suez. And so we were following the Ever Given. But then, one of my viewers, and it was a handful at the time, sat there and said, there's other ships out there. Maybe you should talk about them. And I went from 136 subscribers on my YouTube channel to I think I went over 316,000 the other day.
That's incredible.
So it's in 3 years. It's been nuts.
Well, I love about your background is that it's hard to know where you are unless you know where you've been, and you can't know where you're going unless you know the history that got you there. So understanding, how things got to be where they are gives you really good indication of where the future is going. What can we expect next week? I mean, what is happening right now between the longshoremen? What is going on?
So as you aptly said, number one, the unions, unions are a backbone of the maritime sector. I mean, this has been something, if you look at the history of sailing and working ashore, what happened was they were basically really exploited for a long time. One of my favorite cases in the U.S. Supreme Court is what's referred to as the Arago decision of 1893, which was a decision where basically the Supreme Court ruled that merchant mariners, when they signed onto a ship, surrendered their 13th Amendment rights. And so, you had seafarers who were losing their rights. You had dockyard workers who were losing their rights. And what you saw was a massive movement in the United States in the early 20th century to unionize, led to a massive strike on the West Coast. You saw them on the East Coast. And so unions really became the bedrock. And what we see coming up right now is on the East and Gulf Coast of the United States, the International Longshoremen's Association is coming to the end of their 6-year contract. So this is not new. Everybody knew this was coming. There's no surprise here. That September 30th of 2024 is going to be the last day of the master contract. They are working for an entity called the U.S. Maritime Alliance, which is a strange thing. It's a consortium of both the terminal operators along the coast. It's the companies that employ the longshoremen, but it's also the ocean carriers, the big ocean carriers that bring in the ships. Matter of fact, if you look at the board of directors, of the 15 board of directors, 8 of them represent these ocean carriers, and they're a who's who of ocean carriers. You've got Hapag-Lloyd, you got Maersk, you've got the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company on there, and what is happening right now is that the union, the ILA, is saying that come midnight on September 30th, they're going on strike. And if you see any image of the union, just go, Google search ILA and Harold Daggett, and he gives a speech where I am of the opinion that I believe him. They're walking out on midnight, September 30th, so that on October 1st, there is going to be no labor to work. Now, we don't know exactly what that means yet, because the ILA services largely container ships, but they also do car carriers. They also do cruise ships in a lot of ports. They're the line handlers. They're the guys that throw off the lines for vessels. So this impact has not been fully appreciated yet. Plus, they also do military cargo. But I think right now, if I'm betting on this, I am taking the ILA for their word that they're going to go on strike on Tuesday. Now, we can talk about what that means, because I think there's a lot of implications coming forward with that.
I like to think, as you kind of outlined initially about the unionization of that group of workers over time, a lot of things we kind of take for granted, like child labor laws, working hours, all sorts of benefits we see as modern employees. Those were fought tooth and nail by unions decades ago. So it's always important to remember like where they brought us to. But as we look at what happens next, it seems like the big argument seems to be two issues. One, compensation and wages, and then the other one being about automation. Can you kind of speak a little bit about what those two real questions are that the union is fighting for?
Sure. I come back to the issue of Labor Day. Labor Day is the greatest irony of a day off because, you know, you celebrate the hard work of people who never got a day off by getting a day off.
That's right.
And in the case of the unions here, there's two issues, as you said, wages and automation. So wages straightforward. They want a pay raise. They feel like over the past 6 years, obviously we have all felt the same crunch of inflation. Things have changed, but the most significant thing is the fact that the ocean carriers, which are the main portion of the USMX, have had their largest increase in revenue in history. Ocean carriers are very unique. I know you talk about trucking a lot on the channel, and you know, trucking and shipping is about the diametrically opposed industries as you can imagine, because ocean carriers, the container liners, are congregated in 10 large shipping firms. 85% of all capacity is in those 10 firms and organized in largely 3 alliances, now about to undergo a big change in the alliances here, but very centralized. So, I mean, they're the controlling interest here. But the most insignificant thing is because of the supply chain crisis, because of what happened with COVID, and because of the change of buying patterns of everyone, the ocean carriers made more profit in 2021 than they did in the previous decade combined. Wow. Then in 2022, they did more. And then in 2023, they didn't do as much, but it was falling off. But you know, if you're the ILA, if you're the longshoreman, you're like, hey, okay, you know, you guys made a massive profit. Now, the ocean carriers spent that profit. I mean, they're sailors with money in their pocket. They're going to spend it. I mean, that's what I did when I was a sailor. You know, got to spend that money in port. And what did they do? They bought infrastructure. They bought terminals. They bought logistics, you know, distribution systems. You know, you got some of them buying air travel or air freight companies. The biggest thing they've bought is ships. Because when you buy a ship, you buy it up front. You put the money down. There's no loans. You go in. You don't buy a ship till you have the money for it. And what we're seeing is this massive shipbuilding expenditure that's going in. Well, ILA is saying, listen, we worked during COVID. We had to be in the docks. We exposed
essential workers.
Although they weren't identified quite as essential workers, but they were there working through COVID. And they're like, okay, you made profits. You know, everyone made profits. We want that share. You're talking about right now that the negotiation they had was talking about a 32% pay raise. ILA wants more. They want somewhere in the range of 70%.
I saw that. That's right. Over the course of the next 6 years for that contract.
Right. It's a 6-year contract. So it's not like a 72% pay raise, but it's factored in over time. And you got to be careful about looking at ILA pay. Everyone's going to quote the fact that ILA longshoremen make $200,000 a year. Okay, there are ILA longshoremen that make $200,000. There's no doubt about that. But longshoreman work is also dependent on cargo coming in. It's not like you're getting a salary check every month. It doesn't work that way. It's also, you have to go through stages and work your way up through the system to get more and more of that salary. So it's a very complicated system, but the wage is obviously the big one. On the flip side of that, the big thing that the ocean carriers and the U.S. Maritime Alliance and the terminals want is efficiency in the ports. They want to see the U.S. ports become more efficient. If you look at the World Bank Index, which rates port efficiency, U.S. ports are not good. I mean, they're just not. They come on the back end of it. I think the most efficient port in the U.S. in the most recent rating was Charleston at about 53 out of roughly 400 ports.
Wow.
So it's efficient, but nowhere near it. But you look at like at the bottom, I mean, you see L.A., Long Beach, New York, New Jersey, Savannah. I mean, all the big ports are kind of down toward the bottom. And there's a variety of issues that are at play here. I would argue it's not just automation. And when we say automation, what type of automation? Are you talking about getting the longshoreman out of the container crane? That's really not the issue. I got to tell you that a longshoreman in a crane, it sometimes is more efficient than an automated crane. The really big thing is the sorting and really the delivery of the container out of the terminal into the hands of the trucker, the rail. That's where you start getting into the nitty gritty here of it. And obviously you have the bomb carts that move the containers around in the terminals, the handlers. But the big thing is obviously the ports want to become more efficient. That means automation. And unfortunately, what the two groups haven't been able to do is come up and sit down to a point where they can discuss automation while protecting the workers that are currently in the ILA as some of them begin to transition out into retirement. Because if I'm the ILA, I'm worried about my members. I'm worried about my retired members. I'm worried about having enough money coming in to pay for my retired members. Hard work. I mean, it's brutal work.
Absolutely.
It is really tough. So the retirement is a big issue. And unfortunately, what we have right now is the U.S. Maritime Alliance is releasing press releases saying, we're at the table, we're ready to negotiate. The ILA isn't here. The ILA is saying it doesn't matter if we're at the table if they won't negotiate. So what we have is negotiation through press releases right now.
It's interesting you brought up a little bit earlier about how different it is, the service transportation versus the shipping companies generally, of consolidation versus fragmentation. If you go back in the way back before deregulation from the motor carriers back in 1980, it was like that. It was very much these giant organizations, Yellow, CF, Roadway, Moved America. These were companies that were running in the 1920s. And even before there was any containerization or standardization, which was more like in the 50s and 60s. So it was started with the trucking companies to break them apart and fragment them. There's no way you can break apart the big shipping companies. They need that scale. But as we look at like the wage issue, these are all hourly workers, right? They may be making 30, 40 bucks an hour, overtime, double time, holiday pay. That's how you start seeing. So these are not men and women working 40 hours and getting paid 200 grand. These are probably men and women who have worked for, let's say, 15, 20 years, working 50, 60 hours a week. And that's how they get those numbers. That's a really interesting thread to kind of look at. Now, on the automation front, I find this fascinating. I've always said the best application for autonomous vehicles are spotting trucks. They call them hostlers or shunters or work dogs or yard goats. But like that's a place you automate. That's a great opportunity. But it seems that the union has been very reluctant to see that kind of technology creep in. Can you actually stop it from getting in? Is there any way to do that?
No, I mean, I think that's, issue we were kind of talking about before the show. I just read a book on the development of Port Newark. And, at the time, Malcolm McLean is there and they bring in one of the very first container ships and he's sitting there alongside an ILA person and, and McLean's like, that's the future. And the ILA guy is like, we should sink it right here. It's like, it's technology coming in. There's a couple of issues here. One of the reasons why we see such efficiency in ports overseas is they're brand new ports.
Yeah.
You look at Shanghai, you look at the ports, right? Even Rotterdam in some ways, it's a brand new port in many ways because they're building out from the old traditional ports and they're building new ones. And, that has been something that has been key here. And that's the thing the ILA has to be worried about, I would tell you, because again, if you look at development of ports in the United States, who is the one that's scaring them all? It's Savannah. Savannah right now is the big port that's scaring everybody because it's where the population base is. It can basically bring in non-labor union and it can automate and it can really become a much more efficient port. And so you have to have this give and take. The problem is that you need to be doing these negotiations all the time. And this is the problem I think that we're having now is that because of COVID and because of the really the peak of shipping we've seen with just this massive influx of cargo coming in. If you look at the cargo capacities, of the ports, they've been phenomenal. I mean, this past year they dropped off, but go from 2020 to 2023 and banging numbers here. Everyone's making money at this point, and it's the negotiation. The problem is everyone's remembering when it wasn't great, and that's the problem. Is like, okay, we got to make sure that we're protecting our workers during those kind of lean periods. Because you're right, an ILA member makes his money, he or she makes his money when they're working. But there are times when, hey, there's no ships coming in, there's no work. It's just what it is. And we're going to have to fix that. But I do think that one of the key things we have to be talking about right here is that the ILA sees this as their moment. The timing of this contract is so key. I mean, because you have a lame duck administration, the Biden administration, pro-labor, that is, you had Biden on a picket line at some point, and so pro-labor coming in, even if you enact Taft-Hartley and you get the 80-day or 60-day cooling down period, you have a new administration that's on the horizon. You've got the Harris or Trump administration coming in. What does that mean going forward? If you have tariffs with the Trump administration, that's going to create the chaos we saw in 2018, 2019. And I just think the ILA is sitting there going, this is our moment. You cannot ask for anything better than this. If they don't go on strike after saying everything they said, they're going to look weak. They're going to look like they're not going to follow through. Why listen to them? And I think the way they get their attention is by doing this.
Now, that's an interesting point you bring up, because I think back to when Yellow was on the cusp of bankruptcy and they were fighting with the Central State Fund, and they had not made the payment, and they said, we're not going to make the payment. And they said, well, we're going to lose insurance for 11,000 families. We're going to go strike. And over the course of the weekend, they negotiated a deal where the Teamsters were going to allow them to continue working, even if the Central State Fund was not paid. Do you think this weekend we're going to walk in on Monday and it's going to be, we took care of it, we're all buddies again? Do you think that's feasible, or is that not?
I think it's a really hard one to do, because again, if you look at the most recent one we had, which was the ILWU, the International Longshore Warehouse Union on the West Coast, and the Pacific Maritime Association, they went past their deadline. They went past their deadline, and they had a year where they were negotiating, on that contract. But there was a lot of other factors that were at play there too. The ILWU had a near monopoly in all the ports. They also were under some pressure from the Biden administration at the time not to have that happen. I think you may see, a brokered deal, but again, there's videos and imageries, and the message you're getting from Harold Daggett and the ILA is like, we're going, there's, and what gets me even more is the ocean carriers are making these statements now. I mean, you're seeing the ocean carriers are putting in their surcharges. They're making their changes. You've got the ports coming out. Beth Ann Rooney over in the port of New York, New Jersey, just unveiled, this is what we're going to do if the port shuts down, and everything. And I also got to think too, Matthew, it's really important to say this. If the ILA walks out on Tuesday, October 1st, you don't see any. There's no impact. There's no immediate impact right off the bat. I mean, it's not like all of a sudden the shelves are empty and everything comes havoc. It takes time for this. And as well as I do, it's going to follow that path like we saw with the Houthi in the Red Sea, where there's going to be an immediate spike. People will panic because people panic. That's what they do. And everyone's going to buy every roll of toilet paper, even though toilet paper is not imported in the United States. We make it here. Everyone's going to go buy toilet paper. You'll have this big spike. It'll settle back down again, but then the long-term impacts start coming in. And I think this is really where the ILA realizes they have a lot of leverage here. 50% imports, exports coming into through the East and Gulf Coast ports. If all of a sudden you stop moving containers in and out of the United States, this has a butterfly effect across the entire supply chain network. Because all of a sudden, I'll give you something very simple. Empty containers are not coming out of the United States. If you don't have empty containers coming out of the United States in large numbers, there's a finite amount of empty containers in the world. That container, chain has been stretched because of the Houthi. You got to add an additional 5,000 to 8,000 miles on your voyages now.
Wow.
And which means that if containers don't leave in October from the United States, they're not back in East Asia by November, December. They're not there for the February, March kind of kickback up of it. And now you see the long-term impact. And, one of the things we've seen over the past 3 years that I've been doing this is Ever Given gets stuck for 6 days in the Suez. The effect of Ever Given getting stuck in the Suez is 4 months. I mean, you see the system get thrown off. Houthi right now diverting around Africa. If the Houthi tomorrow said, you know what, love and kisses, we're done, you can start coming through the Red Sea, that's going to take 3 to 4 months to do. And I think the ILA know we're going to cause more attention if we do this. There'll be pressure coming not just from within the United States, but from the outside. I also think the ILA is sitting there going, we're a union. Nobody likes us anyway. What do we care? Nobody likes unions. Our focus is not our perception. It's the bottom line. And these guys have been making money for a long time. We want our share.
If ILA goes on strike, let's just say that there isn't a final deal, or they decide they're not going to work without the contract like the West Coast counterparts did. If it does go on strike, if it goes on for a week or two, probably not the end of the world, but how long until it really, to your point earlier, until the impacts become almost impossible to untangle when you're talking months and months and months of.
Right. So again, you go back to the issue. Okay, what are we talking about here? I think the ILA would be stupid to strike regarding cruise ships. They would, I mean, that would be the biggest blowback they get, because that's how most Americans get any view of maritime. So I think there'll be an exception for that. I think that the industry that gets hit the first is going to be manufacturing, because manufacturing cannot have stockpiles of machinery parts for building. They're literally running on just in time. As much as we say we get away from it, they can't, because you're running on production cycles overseas to get goods in here. They're the ones that are going to have the biggest impact. All of a sudden, you're going to see truck and car manufacturers, tractor manufacturers, machinery, you name it. Key components and parts are not going to be going in. So you're going to start seeing that impact right away. I mean, food's not an issue. 85% of our food is grown in the US. So maybe you don't get your imported, whatever it is.
Olive oil, Sal, my olive oil.
Your olive oil is going to be a big one. Bananas are the one everyone's kind of freaking out about right now. Bananas are going to be the big one. So you're going to see it in some key commodities. But again, it goes to the issue, and you know it as well as I do, that a lot of goods are already free flowing and moving. We've already seen this. We saw that some people have shifted to the West Coast. We see the numbers going up in the West Coast ports. If you look at the trend in West Coast ports from 2017, go back before even the supply chain crisis, West Coast ports were gradually losing their business. They were losing their business, and that was largely because of the opening of the new lane of the Panama Canal. You could bring container ships through the Panama Canal that no longer were 4,500 box ships, but now you can bring 17,000 box ships. Well, it's rained in the Panama Canal. Panama Canal is wide open. That went away, but we're still seeing the West Coast getting these additional numbers. And as well as I do, you can't just turn a ship around. You can't just sit there. Well, I was going to Charleston. Now I'm going to go to LA. That doesn't work, because you have to have the infrastructure set up to receive that cargo. You got to have warehouses, distribution centers. And the big fear is you're going to create a mirror to a lesser extent of what happened in 2021 on the West Coast. You'll jam up the system because we haven't really fixed the drayage problem, which is worse, I would argue, on the West Coast. You haven't fixed Class 1 rails. You've moved a lot of distribution centers from the West Coast to the East Coast because it was found to be cheaper to set them up in Georgia and South Carolina and Texas. So it's going to have, again, it'll be the immediate effect. You're going to feel it all of a sudden. You'll see the panic. Things will settle down. Oh, it's not as bad. You can still get things, but then the long-term impacts hit, and that's when things resonate. And the damage that happens here, if the ILA is out for more than a week, it starts having long-term knock-on effects, so that even if they come back in, you've damaged the system. I always, the analogy for me for supply chain is always going to be, kind of the blood vessels of the body.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. I love that analogy.
If you pinch off the blood going to your pinky a little bit, it's not a big deal. You can still work. You can still operate. If you do it for a long time, you're going to permanently damage the pinky. If you do it to, the vein, the artery going to your arm, it's going to have a more detrimental effect over time. And the longer you do it, the more catastrophic it becomes. And it'll take longer to recover from it, if you can even recover for it. Because that's the other thing the ILA has to be worried about, is that if they go for too long, they damage themselves to such a position that the West Coast and potentially non-union ports take the business away from them. And then they're worse to themselves than what could potentially happen with not going on strike.
I think that's a great point you bring up, because the longer it goes, the other ports can find a way to absorb some of that capacity. Maybe we don't see ships sitting out for months on end. Maybe you see a backlog of a couple dozen ships, maybe 100 ships, but that change in behavior is hard to reverse. So once it goes that direction, you really can't pull it back. I'm kind of curious on your thoughts on what specifically on the automation front are the longshoremen so against? Because I've read they want a ban on automation. I've seen different ways of talking about it. The wages make sense to me. I understand what increases over time could be, but what do you think the automation piece really is that's driving this?
So, if you listen to the most recent issue, so one of the things that got them really spun up, and they've said this, was the introduction of an auto gate system down in the port in Mobile, Alabama. Now, let me be clear, that gate system had been there for a while. It's like all of a sudden realizing there's an issue. It's like they realize there's an issue because it's an issue they can raise. And so they're like, well, this is the big problem. They've introduced this auto gate system where basically you remove the personnel and you can scan in, scan out, and that removes some employees. Mobile had been transitioning to that for a while and everything. Again, it goes back to that efficiency issue. And I know, I'm sure you do it. Every time I post a video and I talk about ports and everything, I'll get the truckers on there. It's like, oh, longshoremen. They just, they're standing around doing nothing. They make me wait. I got to stand in, out in line for 4 hours with no bathroom. And while these guys are making money. And the automation issue is really key because, again, there's different levels of automation, as you mentioned. What are we talking about here? I think what you look at, like, for example, if you look at LA and Long Beach, LA and Long Beach automated some of the terminals. They got really efficient. The Long Beach Container Terminal, LBCT, is probably the model of efficiency you want to be at. That's an efficient terminal. That's a terminal that's moving containers in a very, logical manner. They're using automation, but at the same time, they were very careful in how they dealt with their workers not to lay off everyone. Yeah. And the union has to be careful of that too. One of the things that the ILW in the West Coast during the peak of the supply chain crisis resisted like crazy was bringing new members on. They didn't want to bring on new members. They were very careful about that because they said, yeah, there's a lot of business going on, but if I bring on new members, union members, I got to worry about paying them later on. Yeah, and more importantly, their retirement. And so the ILA has got to figure out how they can sit down with the USMX and come up with an automation plan and schedule that allows them to phase out and still maintain their workers. And again, I think we want that in all industries, but the ILA is in a position where they can use not just national pressure, but international pressure to kind of get that done. I'm really amazed. The thing that's amazed me the most about all of this is the absolute silence from the administration on it. I mean, just, there was a statement that came out that they're not going to invoke Taft-Hartley. Well, they can't do that anyway until the strike happens. So that's kind of a moot point. But, if I'm president, it's like I'm grabbing the head of the USMX, the head of ILA, putting them in a room or at least getting them on a video call. It's like, okay, what do we need to do to get you to, at least the image that you're talking to each other? But there's been nothing.
This is the thing. I think you're exactly right. What I've been kind of curious about is we don't see this reported largely in the news. And I think Americans are more conditioned of let's wait for the crisis to happen and then we'll react to it. We don't need to be proactive in crisis management. We'll just deal with it when it happens. And the fact the Biden administration is not more aggressively trying to get something put together, maybe it has to be a political expedience thing. Let's let them figure it out themselves and we'll react to it just like the rest of us. But longer term, the future is clear to me. I mean, the drayage operators is a great example. Those will be automated. Like the ability to have a truck come into a terminal and just go to a single place and then go to a warehouse. Like that is, I think, well within the capabilities of current technology. So where do you see these ports going in 5 to 10 years? If we can automate singular components, really, you're going to get to a place where it's robots doing a majority of the stuff anyway. Are we just fighting about like delaying the inevitable?
Well, it goes back to looking at the development of ports in the United States. So I'm going to take a little bit of history here. We're going to go back for a second. If you look at the United States, there's 4 big ports in terms of imports. You got the LA Long Beach complex, you got New York, New Jersey, you got Savannah, you got Houston. Those are the 4 big ones. But on the U.S. East and Gulf Coast ports, you got the kind of second tier ports. You've got Charleston, you've got Miami, you've got Jacksonville, you got Mobile. You've got New Orleans developing a container port. And, so it's a lot different. If you look at how containers move around the oceans right now, they tend to move into these big kind of mega ports, and then they kind of come out into smaller feeders and out. And the key thing of those mega ports are the ones that you see in Rotterdam and Felixstowe, Algeciras, Tangier. Those are the big ones. Those are the ones where you see all that automation. They're absolutely efficient moving in containers. The U.S. is weird because on the West Coast of the United States, if you bring a container ship to the West Coast of the United States, 80% of your load is going to go off in LA and Long Beach, almost guaranteed. You're going to offload almost everything in LA and Long Beach. You may go to Tacoma, you may go into Oakland or down to a Mexican port or Vancouver, but almost entirely you go in there. If you come to the East and Gulf Coast ports, you're hitting 3-4 ports, and it's almost an even distribution. You're taking off about 20 to 40% of your cargo in those ports, because the reason that is because of the transportation system in the interior of the United States on the East and Gulf Coast is geared more toward short haul. It's more, you don't want to do the long haul. So you want to, why is Baltimore a port? Baltimore makes no sense for a port. Makes no sense. I got to go all the way up to Chesapeake Bay. It's a massively long sea transportation until you realize go into Baltimore and you're astride the I-95 turnpike. And more importantly, you're within reach of a whole batch of megalopolises where you can basically dump into.
That's right.
And okay, now Baltimore makes sense to me. It makes perfect sense to me to go ahead in there. And this is, I would argue, what's been resisting the automation in the ports, because the ports have been growing gradually, and it's a series of ports. It's not one big port. Savannah's the different. Savannah was the big exception, where Savannah has been the only port really on steroids. We've seen massive growth happening. That's because of the population shift. But the other ports have all kind of begin to, even New York, New Jersey, which used to be the finger piers around Manhattan and Brooklyn, it moved across to Newark, but it still was an old port to begin with. Almost all of these are old ports. And it's really hard to create a new clean port unless you literally wipe the slate clean. Yeah. Felixstowe there's nothing in Felixstowe before Felixstowe. It was down the Thames. Used to go into East London is where you went into. Rotterdam was pushed out from Rotterdam. It's pushed out. Shanghai literally takes an island off the coast and just dumps dirt to it so you can create a path, and they create the biggest container terminal complex in the world. Same thing in Salalah, in Oman, in Dubai. You create these ports out of nowhere. And so in many ways, we're dealing with old technology, old ports, and an old labor system. And it's very hard for us to upgrade our infrastructure. It's the highway system. It's the rail system. Ports are no different than what you talk about when you talk about the inland terminals. Why is it so hard to get Class 1 railways up and advanced and moving, get high-speed rail in, improve our system of trucking on the roads? Now, it eventually hits an inflection point, and I think the ILA has got to be careful about pushing this inflection point too much, because they may automate themselves out of a job if they go on strike and stay on strike too long, because everyone's saying the same thing. I lost my job because of automation. I worked in a bank. I don't work in a bank anymore. It's a clerk. It's an ATM, or I was a toll booth collector. That's gone. All these jobs go away. And I think the ILA has got to be very cognizant of this, that they may lose themselves if they're not careful.
Yeah, I think the American population doesn't want to pay more for things. And I think the thinking some people have is, if you prevent automation, if you prevent ways to save money, then you're going to just make it more expensive for everybody else. And when I think about like this challenge of technology we see, as regulators, it really kind of outpaces our ability to regulate it. I look at, there's a Class 1 rail in Illinois that got hit for a biometric privacy invasion type of thing. They were scanning drivers' retinas and then their fingerprints, and they were hit with, I think, $5,000 per scan fee for not disclosing and having the driver sign off. So I can understand like the reluctance to adopt certain technologies. And I do also get concerned on, what does the cybersecurity look like? How do you build something that can't be hacked or destroyed by your adversaries? And those are things that would make me hesitant to adopt technology. But to your point, it's inevitable. I mean, I've been in high-speed manufacturing facilities that are doing precision manufacturing where there are no humans. There's a lot of human being mechanics who will service that equipment, but there is not humans that are hand packing things into boxes anymore. So I wonder, like, if we were to start from scratch, like, is the pathway to modernize the existing ports, or to kind of like a Shanghai, build something out of nothing and then build it the way that we want the supply chain of the future to work?
But that's the danger, I would argue, because, what you'll see is like, what, I'm going to go to Georgia or some state that's going to be really working for me, and I'm going to put in a megaport. I'm just going to build this thing from scratch. And if I can get past EPA and everything and build it, I'm going to put in a port that's going to be ideal, because I can automate it, I can do it, and I can move it. Because, the thing that's changed, again, I go back to this all the time when I talk about ocean shipping. In 1950, we moved 500 million tons of cargo on the world's oceans. In 2023, we moved 12 billion tons. So, I mean, it's a 22-fold increase that you have. We have increased the volume and velocity of how we move things. And, when you look at some ports around the world, U.S. ports move a lot of cargo. I mean, they really do. I mean, it's not like, you can't compare to Shanghai, because Shanghai is such a major, it's a transit point. There's so many containers moving in and out of the port, and being exchanged and moved around. It's not always a good measure. But they're moving a lot. The problem you have is we've, as you mentioned, changed. I mean, the containerization movement that was created by Malcolm McLean, just absolutely cratered, ocean freight because it got so cheap. It's just,
Exactly.
there's no cost for it. If you got a 40-foot long container and I load it with phones, what's the cost? Even at the peak of when the supply chain went to $20,000 to get a container across, if I have 1,000 phones in there, it's still minute what I'm paying for the shipment of that one item. And especially with open registries, which were created post-war, and now you're registering in Panama and Liberia and the Marshall Islands, all those costs come down. But one of the things I think we see is what happened with Dolly leaving Baltimore, where there are, we're moving at such a pace at times that when you rely on humans, humans are a problem too. I mean, it's not just automation in the ports, it's automation on the ships. And we didn't have automation on the ships. There was no protection on that ship to make sure that when they lost power, that there wasn't really the backup to kind of kick power back on.
That's right.
And so we are looking at this throughout the industry. And this is an element that we have. The maritime sector usually leads. But I would argue in this one area, it's been a big problem. The U.S. industry in particular has been lagging on it. And again, it also goes to how we operate ports. Ports are under the control of local municipal governments. It's state, it's the Port of Long Beach. Literally, there's a council elected from the city of Long Beach that oversees the Port of Long Beach. I would argue it's not a Long Beach port. It's a U.S. port. The U.S. government controls the waters, but the state and local governments control the ports. And it's also competition between them too. It's like when Baltimore had the bridge go down, everyone's like, well, the other ports will pick it up. It's like, yeah, the other ports will pick it up and try to steal the business
and keep it. Yeah, exactly. They'll take it and they'll try to keep it.
That's what they want because it's cutthroat. It's like, I know some of these port directors, and when the Port of New York, New Jersey outperforms the Port of LA and Long Beach, that's not something to crow about. That's just like, oh, it's a good rivalry. It's like, no, we're making business and we're going to take that business and keep that business and make it come. And that's what the ILA has to realize too, is like, that's the other element here, is that these ports compete against each other and they want to get the traffic and business in. And if I'm a shipper, and I'm shipping cargo in, or I'm a carrier and I want to ship cargo in, do I want to go to a port where I know there's a labor problem, or do I want to go to those non-union ports and I'm like, I'm going to go in there and everything. There's a lot of debate about requiring tugs for ships coming in and out. That's great. That's fantastic. But if you do that, that increases costs. And while everyone is on this binge about safety, I'm not going to go to that port because it's going to cost me a little bit extra. I want to go where I maximize profits because, again, we all know it's all about efficiency and profitability. And the container companies now have profitability and they want to keep that.
Someone needs to think of the shareholders. These poor shareholders, all they want is a good return on investment. They've put in the time and the money of watching the stock tick up and down. Someone's got to protect them. But
just be careful about that because some of the largest shipping company in the world, Mediterranean Shipping Company, is a family-owned business. The Aponte family owns it. There's no shareholders. It is a mom and pop operation, which is crazy to think of the scale. But
oh my goodness, that you bring up a very good point. The consolidation of some of these things is spectacular. The family offices are full on massive businesses. I also think it's important to kind of note you brought up before about the ports competing with each other. This is, to your point, these are not American ports like as they identify themselves. This is like Amazon versus Walmart. This is Disney versus Netflix. This is like truly companies that really want to see themselves succeed. And if they get business been diverted to them, they will do whatever it takes to retain that business. So the longshoremen have this really challenging moment in front of them. Like they're trying to protect their initial workers by getting raises and wages and all this. They're trying to protect their future members through however they can limit automation or restrict it in some meaningful way. And then they still have to know that if they do it for too long, that freight will never come back, or maybe it won't come back in the same way that they had, or it'll incentivize the American population to say, let's start from scratch on some other place and we'll see if we can avoid these problems. Now, this is more tactical. If you're in this business now, you're a freight broker, you're a motor carrier, how do I think about this story? How do I think about what impact it might have to me in the next week, 2 weeks, or month?
Well, one of the things I've been talking about since the situation we saw with the backlogs off LA and Long Beach was if you're a broker, you need to be thinking about diversification. You cannot be banking on one entry port as your only source coming in. You have got to have backups in place so that you can be able to, as flexible and nimble as you can, be able to shift ports. I mean, we're seeing that. We're seeing cargo moving by air, but air capacity is at its limit. We just don't have any more airspace to really pack ships, aircraft on. We also got a little bit of a fuel problem right now, getting enough jet fuel out there. So we're seeing that escalation cost. Guarantee you right now, someone doesn't even know this is going to happen, or they're not seeing this, or better yet, their cargo is on a ship they thought was heading to a port that's not going to be affected by this, but it is. And I mean, we're literally going to see, if this happens on midnight on September 30th into October 1st, ships tied up at the dock can't leave. I mean, they literally can't leave because the ILA does the lines, and you can't touch the lines unless you're an ILA worker. And so we're going to see ships stuck. I mean, they're literally going to be stuck. And so, if you're the broker and if you haven't gotten that figured out yet, that's a problem. Obviously, if you can shift over to the West Coast, that's a short-term solution. I mean, you're seeing Canadian ports being talked about, Mexican ports coming in, the Mexican ports of entry coming in. We're seeing ship cargo going down to Panama onto smaller feeder vessels, potentially coming up to some of the smaller ports. Again, it goes into the issue of how you can get that freight moved. The problem is some of that cargo is coming from Asia around Africa. It sailed 4 weeks ago. And, at the time, the ILA, may not have been really on everyone's radar. They'll get this figured out. But as we're coming to the brink now, there's not a lot you can do. There's no ship. There's no way you're going to divert vessels in at this point. So, if you haven't made it, and I'm really interested to hear the numbers come out, because I do think a lot of people front forwarded as much as they could. So, when I walk into Walmart and Home Depot and everything, and I see everything piled up out there, I think, okay, a lot of people were thinking here, they were getting here. But as well as I do, there are a lot of smaller shippers and companies out there that don't have that ability. I can't buy it until now. I don't have the money to do it. I don't have the credit to do it. So I got to do it now. And they're just hoping for the best. And unfortunately, they're really at the mercy of the system that's about to unfold.
I think I'd like to kind of pull the thread on the Mexican ports a little bit. So
Sure.
and as a student of history, as I like to think of myself, I'm not an expert by any means. I'm a lawyer, not a historian.
We don't hold that against. I don't hold you against you, Matthew. My wife's a lawyer, so
we're the best and the worst people in the world. I like the trends and forces. I believe in the trends and forces of history. So there's these things that there might be individual people who make big changes, but really there's this movement. And we've seen, we call it nearshoring or China plus one, this philosophy of we need to find other places. And Mexico has become a very good spot for doing domestic manufacturing, or North American manufacturing. What would stop someone to basically make a mega port in Mexico? And then be able to break that bulk apart, toss it on the rails or toss it on the back of a truck and bring it to the United States? Like, is that a threat that as Americans we should think about as we look at this potential strike on the East Coast?
No. I mean, it's been talked about for quite a bit. The biggest limitation is rail in Mexico. That's the biggest. That's going to be your limitation, is the Class 1 rail getting out of a Mexican megaport. And we see them developing on the West Coast. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about that. It was just a Wall Street Journal article was just out on this, talking about the $7.5 billion project to be able to move cargo across from the West Coast of Mexico to the East Coast. They're really trying to dig into that. Problem you have is the inherent Class 1 rail system that's exists in Mexico, and of course the ports of entry coming in. As long as you clear the ports of entry, you're good, but those are not dependable ports of entry at many times. Something happens, you shut down the port, and rail can't come across sometimes. So that's the other element that comes in. I think Mexico is a very suitable one. But one of the things we have been seeing, but if you look at the decrease in imports coming in from Mexico, measure that against the increase of imports into Mexico, from China. We're importing less from China. Well, a lot of those imports that were coming to us now are going into Mexico. So I think we're starting to see that quite a bit. And even if you nearshore, even if you start setting up factories and production centers in Central South America, you still got a shipping issue. You still have to get that cargo into the United States. And it really goes back to, if we had a national port strategy, which we don't, we have nothing like this. There's nothing like this exists. But if you had a national port strategy, do you go as like, okay, we're going to go with the four corner strategy. We're going to go with LA, Long Beach, Houston, Savannah, New York, New Jersey. Those are our mega ports. Let's automate them. Let's those be the focus where we're going to focus our automation, make those ports as efficient as you can. And then the smaller ports become feeder ports up and down the West Coast. You develop Oakland, Coos Bay, Seattle, Tacoma, San Diego, same thing along there. And then, those ports would slowly transition to more automation over time. But that's a national strategy, and we just don't have that right now. It would do a lot to free up space on board, on I-95, the I-5, on the rail systems. There, you get into a Jones Act issue, which I don't want to get into because it's a whole other issue you get with U.S. built ships if you're moving cargo between U.S.
Oh,
ports.
that's right. Okay.
But if you had a national port strategy, that I think would help with the labor issue. It's like, okay, we're targeting this. Federal money is coming in here to help automate you, to make it more productive, because we benefit from this immensely. If our ports are more productive, then we're able to lower transportation costs, move cargo more efficiently. Because let's be clear, we learned nothing from the supply chain crisis. Nothing. I'm 100% clear. We learned nothing, because I'm watching what's happening in LA and Long Beach right now, and it's deja vu. I mean, you're watching the empty containers pile up, and I'll go back. Lauren Began's watching us right now.
I love
Lauren Began
Lauren.
and I have this issue where the FMC did a report in 2015 that predicted everything that happened in the supply chain crisis. Everything that happened, they predicted it, and it went nowhere, because there was no way to implement those changes. And I think we really need someone to think about this. When we talk about infrastructure in the United States, it's obviously we're talking about road, rail, bridges, because that's what we see. What we don't see is ports. No one sees the ports. We have huge sea blindness. And things like Dolly and this potential port strike and other issues around the world really open our eyes to it. And if we had a national port strategy where we had, we weren't just doling out federal money because you had a snazzy packet that came in and it looks good. Why am I building more rail into Long Beach? Does more rail into Long Beach really help me? If I put more cargo into LA and Long Beach, it doesn't help me. I'm in LA and Long Beach. It doesn't help.
Yeah.
But I can't build another port on the West Coast in California without a lot of insight and a lot of money, because I need it in Southern California because I got to get over the mountains. I can't build it in Oakland because I'm stuck on the mountains. I can't build it up in the north because I got to go over the top of the mountains. I got to build it in Southern California. But who's going to invest in building an infrastructure in the Southern California, if not the federal government?
This is an interesting, as you talk about this, a national strategy around ports, which is lacking clearly. I think back, I'm going to bring my surface transportation kind of thinking about what happened with Yellow. Yellow was going to try to consolidate their network. They called it One Yellow, and it was going to basically make it so that the company could live, that it could survive. And the Teamsters said no. They said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to capitulate. We're not going to let this thing happen. But as you've outlined, this idea of a national port strategy with super ports that would handle a lot more of the automation and then let other ports handle smaller capacity, I think that makes sense. But the barrier becomes the labor. And
right.
When does this become a national security issue versus I need stuff now at a reasonable price? Is there a lever that gets pulled, or is there a moment in time where we see that as the actual kind of national security issue that it is? Or is it always going to be kind of stuck in this place of it's just a logistics thing, they'll figure it out and we don't have to worry about it?
Well, I think it becomes a national security issue right about now. I mean, it's like right now. It's like it's been one for a while. And it really is. I mean, if you think about it, it's crazy that we really, allocate this, down there. Airports in the United States are under the FAA. It doesn't matter if you're in Atlanta. It doesn't matter if you're in, North Dakota. The FAA has oversight of it. We don't have a maritime component, organization comparable to the FAA. We got the Maritime Administration, which has very weak powers. And that's a big issue, because we should be having this strategy. One of the things we did was deregulate basically ocean shipping. We chopped the federal the Maritime Administration in half. We lopped off the Federal Maritime Commission. But then in the 80s and into the 90s, we passed a series of pieces of legislation that basically deregulated, because deregulating ocean shipping was seen as great, because what you're doing was offshoring everything. You can take advantage of the open registries. You can take care of foreign crews. You can make it cheaper. And we didn't care about that, because our focus was internal in the United States. This is external. It was great. But now we're realizing, hey, this is a problem. This is a problem because we are being affected by forces outside the United States. I always use the example, if China wants to make us feel bad about ourselves, all they have to do is pick up the phone to the Chinese overseas shipping company that controls 12 to 15% of all the world ships and tell them to slow down. Just slow down. Just come in 2 days late. And you cause havoc around the world. You create a supply chain crisis because every ship shows up 2 days late. That's the easiest amount of soft power that you can do. And this is why it's a national priority. It really is. It's a national issue that when this happens. And, we had a couple of close calls here where we almost saw U.S. ports close. We saw Baltimore close for 2 months, but it's a small port, 2 to 3%. If this happens in Savannah, happens in New York, New Jersey, Houston, it happens in LA and Long Beach. And we're just talking about containers. We're not talking about fuel. We're not talking about export of grain. If you shut these things down, that has a massive impact. We just had a strike in Vancouver up in Washington, where all of a sudden, Vancouver went on strike. And, it's September, grain is flowing out, and now all of a sudden that stops. And that's the impact it has. And that's why I think the ILA is crazy not to go on strike.
Yeah.
I know I'm not advocating it. But I think they have the most power right now to do something and elevate up the attention level. And more importantly, they will elevate it up into a political election cycle for two rival presidents of, running free of an administration, Harris and Trump, basically, coming in, and it'll raise it in the Senate, raise it in the House, it'll raise it in local communities. And all of a sudden, this will propel them up into national attention, which is what they want. And they can get it because they're going to need it going against the U.S. Maritime Alliance, which has a lot of these foreign companies that are basically calling the shots, which they don't like.
So when either Harris or Trump takes office and they give you a call and say, would you help us develop a national port strategy? Are you going to take that call? Are you going to accept that task?
First of all, I'd be shocked if anyone calls me about that. It's like, are you sure you get the right number? Are you not calling? There should be some other people you call. Listen, I work for the government. I actually believe government service. I volunteer firefighter for 25 years. I think you give back and everything. And I don't affiliate myself with a party. I have a party I belong to, but I always tell my students, I'm here to educate, not indoctrinate. Service I think is really important. I do hope that we pay as much attention to the maritime sector as we do to the other sectors. I joke about the idea that the Secretary of Transportation should have the 4 horsemen of the Buddha judge. They should be road, rail, aviation, and sea. And unfortunately, road, rail, and air are pretty good. They got some good powers, those groups. And I know we can argue about whether or not they're good and what they do and everything, but maritime has like almost none. They're really just a shell of what they were. And I think you really need to elevate that up. But I do think things like a national port strategy, a maritime strategy, what's our big issues that we're looking at? Because we are so dependent on it. Yes, we don't import everything we need. We're fortunate that we do produce so much of our own stuff that really what we import lots of times are things that we can get cheaper overseas or luxuries. But it's really crucial, especially in a global environment where we're once again seeing challenges on the high seas. We're seeing the potential of confrontation on the idea of freedom of the seas by Hugo Gratis in 1609 is under challenge once again. And that just elevates it up. We don't have that problem internally in the U.S. If someone takes a shot at somebody on a highway, that's it's police take care of it. We're clear. It doesn't really cause all of a sudden trucking rates to go up. If a country decides to take a pot shot at the ship, it causes ocean rates to go up because of insurance. And now all of a sudden we're paying for that with inflation. What we're seeing, I'll make the argument till I'm blue in the face, that one of the reasons we saw the spike in inflation that we did so much was because of the pent up transportation issues that really just popped as a result of the supply chain crisis. And we saw a lot of inflation all of a sudden start hitting us.
Do you think that this next crisis we'll see will drive the change we want to see in our supply chain? Are we going to get more resilient, or are we just going to wait for it to be done, put our heads in the sand, and then just wait for the next one?
So I think, one of the things that's changed, and I'm going to kind of get on you and me here on this, is the visibility of this has become so much more between what I do, you do, and a whole host of other people that are out there doing it, Lauren, and, and a whole batch of other people, raise the visibility of this. And, the Black Swan events are supposed to be rare events that you see once in a while. They have an impact, then they go away and everything returns back to normal. Well, since COVID, there's been a flock of black swans circling over us, and we haven't been able to get the flock out of here. And they just keep coming down on us, and they keep, it's like throwing stones into a pond. You keep throwing them in, the water never gets flat. It just keeps getting agitated and agitated. And that's where we're at right now. it really needs to be addressed. There's no way to get back to the return, but what we have to do is start paying attention to issues that we've neglected for a long time. I'm always fascinated to learn the fact that there's not enough bathrooms for people to go who are truckers. It just amazes me. It's like I refuse to go to Buc-ee's ever in my life until they allow trucks in. It's one of the stupidest things. I'm not a truck driver. I have nothing to do with truck driving, but it's like, that's the stupidest thing in the world to me. And it's little things like, visibility on topics like this is really important. Ocean is really tough because it's such a niche little thing. The reason I'm where I'm at today is because I'm like a ship whisperer. I can make people understand. I talk ship.
Yeah.
I can make people understand. To a certain extent, what's going on in that industry. And I think it's really important because we don't. And unfortunately, a lot of people who make decisions for us, government and everything, have no idea what the ship they're talking about at times.
I love what you messaged is really a message of encouragement, which is there are more ways to access what's happening in our supply chain and to understand these things. They're not supposed to be some Byzantine system that are completely incomprehensible to people that are outside of the business. I look at Amazon. One of the Amazon effects I like to talk about is the product and the supply chain that brings you the product is the same thing. It's the experience. Bringing the thing to your door within a day or 2 days or whatever has fundamentally changed how we think about the things that we buy. And so much, I can't emphasize this enough to the audience. So much comes on a boat, like so much, like all the things come on a boat. Like yes, there's air, there's rail, but the boat, it's the boat.
My dream. So like, if I could change anything, Sal's king for a world for a day or something like that, is have Amazon, when I order something on Amazon, don't show me the delivery from the distribution center to my house, but go back and show me where it left China, and it's just like, it's already here. This is how it got here. And like, this is the last mile kind of element, because that's all you see is that last mile. That's what we see. I always talk about this in student. I got a chance to introduce a class this past year called Business and Trade, where I do this with students. And I said, when you order that thing from Amazon, it shows up at your house the next day. That product's been moving for 2 to 6 months.
Yeah, exactly. They predicted that you were going to buy it.
Right. It's like they're predicting you're going to buy it. And this is what happened. This is how I explain what happened with the supply chain is when we had the crisis, is the prediction of what you were going to buy changed to such a degree that they couldn't factor it in. Mm-hmm. And then they didn't know when it was going to go back or if it was going to go back to the same thing. Again, the reason we ran out of toilet paper, we domestically produced toilet paper. Reason we ran out of toilet paper wasn't because we all, lost it because of COVID and had to go to the bathroom more. It's because we were at home 24/7.
That's right.
And our consumption of toilet paper changed. If you wanted to buy industrial toilet paper, you can get rolls of that stuff. You were fine to get it. You just couldn't get the 3-ply toilet paper that you're used to, because if you're going to spend money on yourself, am I right, Matt? We're going to spend it on toilet paper.
I'm a bidet guy. I advocate to anyone who will listen that the technology has improved so substantially. You can circumvent this. But is it time to panic now, or do we start panicking a week from now? When is the appropriate time for me, specifically me, to begin panicking?
So my goal here actually is to alleviate panic in many ways. Is like, okay, because like I already know, like October 1st, if I do a video, it's going to be, don't panic. Everyone calm down, take a breath. I live in North Carolina. North Carolina is a state that doesn't get snow, but when we get snow, it's panic. That's right. Pure panic here. It is pure panic. Everyone runs to the stores, buy everything they need. Even though it can snow a foot in a day in North Carolina, it's gone the next day. It's like, as long as you have enough for one day, you're fine. Nothing is going to be short. You're going to be fine. However, it is the attention that's really the most important thing. Mm-hmm. It's at that moment you really need to be going, okay, I want to get this fixed. How do we go about getting this fixed? Let's bring this attention into the spotlight, and what do we learn from it? Because what's going to happen is there's going to be short. We're going to panic. People will buy everything on the shelves. They'll run out to the gas station and fill up every water bottle they have with gas. That's because right. they think it's going to be.
Put it in the bathtub. That's the best place for gasoline. Best place.
Right. And then what we'll see is everything will settle back down. But then as that goes on, we talked about it earlier, the long-term impacts start hitting. And that's where they'll start seeing it. I'm really amazed the disconnect the government has in understanding that. I saw a press conference given by an admiral talking about the Red Sea crisis. And he said, oh, yeah, the industry self-corrected. Everything's good now. It's like, no, it's not. It's like the industry may have self-corrected, but the consumer is paying more and doing that. And so for me, I think we have to alleviate the panic, let everybody know that, listen, even though the ports are shut down on the East and Gulf Coast, we're still moving cargo coming in from other places. And more importantly, the warehouses are full and there's other things. Now, the longer that goes, the more it becomes an issue. And that to me is when the Biden administration is going to have to take action. There is no way they can sit on the sidelines and allow that to happen. Their problem is going to be is how far they want to get over their skis into this for fear that it resonates back to the Harris campaign.
If I was going to put my political hat on, I would say the Biden administration makes no move until after Election Day. And then once that election stuff is done, then they can do the stuff. If the strike goes that long, I'd be very surprised if it goes longer than a month.
The fear is it's October 15th. People are panicking, and Trump administration sits there, or Trump campaign sits there and says, "Look, they're doing nothing. Let me first day I go in, I'm going to fix this. Come in." And then all of a sudden you're in a position like, okay, now I got to do something because the polls are going down. This is why I think the ILA is in a position where I just think they're going to, I know no one wants to say it, but I think they're going to strike. I think everything in my gut is telling me that for them, unless they got everything they asked for, which they won't, unless the U.S. Maritime Alliance is willing to give them a 70-something% pay raise over 5 years and guarantee no automation, which I can't see them doing. I just, why wouldn't they do it? That's the thing that gets me is why wouldn't they do it? It's just like, it's win-win for them. No matter what they do, they'll come out on this on a better situation in their opinion.
Well, when in a couple of weeks, I'll ping you again, Sal. Maybe we'll have you back on the program and explain to us why not panicking was the right move, even though I still think that's probably the best move for me. Where can people find more about you and your content, Sal?
Sure. And I'll probably be completely wrong. So what we're going to find, you go ahead and you can sit there, Matt, and say, well, Sal, man, you blew that one. It's like, well, not the first time. It won't be. Again, I have a long list of being wrong all the time. And if you want that list, just email my wife. She's happy to send it to you. You can find me on YouTube at What's Going On with Shipping. I'm on Twitter at Mercogliano S. Just add the S at the end of my last name. And then always here in beautiful North Carolina at Campbell University, offering classes on an almost daily basis.
I will make sure to put all the links in the show notes. I cannot thank you enough for joining us today, Sal. Thank you for stopping by and helping so many people better understand what I believe will be the biggest supply chain crisis. It's almost here, not quite yet, but it'll be here soon enough, I think.
I'll be with you there in the midst of the panic.
Well, thank you so much, sir. I appreciate you. Well, there you go, everybody. Let me press some buttons here. I cannot thank you enough for joining us today with this incredible conversation with Professor Sal Mercogliano, one of the most well-known experts on the maritime shipping world, historian, professor. I think it was a great conversation. We'll have this all in the show notes. We'll have it in the podcast in a couple of days, maybe. As always, thanks to my friends at DAT. It's in the freight. Thanks for supporting our podcast. And Gear Up has an initiative going on. If you're a trucking company or a trucker that has DAT, you've automatically been upgraded the next tier until I think October 23rd is when it ends, and back October 24th, you're right back at where you were before with no additional costs. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. Have a great day. And then I hit the buttons and it stops.